Hello, comrades, and good morning. I saw a video that had to do with Hegelian dialectics, so that kind of got me thinking about dialectics a little bit. I should really get back to reading more Hegel. I've kind of been neglecting to do that, even though I know I should do that. I feel that the two aspects of Marxism that in terms of theory, that I need to understand better when speaking about old school Marxism. There's the theory of alienation, and then there's some aspects of dialectics. And the reason is that both of those are very Hegelian ideas, you know, used in a totally new way by Marx, but still there's a lot of Hegelian baggage there. I understand them pretty well, but I think there's a couple of things that I don't really truly understand. But speaking about dialectics, I thought that I would just maybe explain a few things that I feel that a lot of people get wrong when they're um, thinking about dialectics or talking about dialectics. Because I made a couple of videos about dialectics a while back, and I was supposed to make one more video, and I never really did because I wanted to do more research. So I think I should just address a couple of those things. Back then, I was in this debate, sort of a back and forth with this person, this Trotskyist, who had pretty much devoted most of their free time apparently into debunking dialectics and every aspect of dialectics. Now, I don't think they actually, debunked it or anything, but I sort of, ended up getting out of that discussion because it just wasn't going anywhere. Um, we didn't agree on anything. We didn't even agree on the premises of most things, but that kind of gave me a lot of good examples of how people can misunderstand dialectics. So it has a lot to do with language. For example, when we're thinking about things turning into their opposites, this is where language becomes a problem, because people think that opposites are like men and women, left and right, hands and feet, black and white, or maybe red and blue. I mean, just sort of depends on the language, depends on the person you ask. Cats and dogs. But none of those things are really opposites when, in the dialectical sense. They might be opposites in, like, cats and dogs. Are they really opposite to each other in every possible way? I mean, not really. There's actually a lot of similarities. They're both animals, they're both mammals, they're both domesticated. It's just a language thing. It's a cultural thing. When things turn into their opposites, does that mean that men turn into women? Of course not. Or cats turn into dogs? Of course not. A famous example, when workers take over, they go from the exploited class to the ruling class. Now, do they become exploiters themselves because they go from exploited to rulers? So wouldn't they become exploiters themselves? Um, no, because in that case, there's also of course, the negation of the negation, which was a very key idea to Marxist dialectics, and even to Hegelian dialectics, that there's always this progress that happens, that each step is higher than the previous one. So we go from primitive communism to a technologically more and scientifically more advanced society, which is primitive agriculture, primitive, cattle raising, primitive private property, and then to slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and finally back to modern communism. So all the way from primitive communism go back to modern communism. But even though it goes back to communism, it's still vastly different, because primitive communism is a much lower stage historically than modern communism, and it's historically a lower stage than capitalism or slave society. Then somebody brought up that I believe in some text, I don't remember which one, but Mao actually says that he didn't really agree with the negation of the negation, that he didn't believe it actually exists, that there's only the law of contradiction and probably the unity of contradiction. And they were like, haha, you see, like Mao, it didn't even agree with dialectics, and it's a core idea of dialectics. Well, I think that's more of just a thing about definitions. Like, the whole idea of the negation is that, why is it the negation of the negation? Why is it just not negation? Because a lot of times Mao would say that, okay, this is the new synthesis, this is the new negation, this is the new synthesis and new negation. So of course, like, there's the first synthesis, whatever it is, then there's the first negation, and then there's the next synthesis, which is the negation of the negation. But you don't necessarily have to call it negation of the negation. I mean, you could call it like, okay, we got the synthesis, then we got the negation, then we got the negation of the negation, then we got the negation of the negation of the negation, and then we got the negation of the negation of the negation of the negation. Like, it's, you know. So I don't think he actually just totally dismissed the idea, the concept of the negation of the negation. I mean, he just, maybe he thought about it differently, maybe he just didn't like the language, but, you know, he uses the negation of the negation all the time. So in my opinion, he probably just meant that it maybe doesn't qualify as a law, like a law of nature, a law of dialectics, because really there's just the unity of opposites and the quality turning into quantity and vice versa, quantity turning into quality. But then the big thing is the idea of self-motion. That's something that was brought up on multiple occasions. So the difficult thing about the idea of self-motion of matter, or, you know, self-motion in general, is that Lenin didn't really extensively talk about it. Nobody really did. I don't remember if Marx ever talked about it, but Lenin talked about it in one or two things. I think in his commentary on Hegel, and then maybe some other stuff, but none of those things were ever published, and I don't think they were even finished. But it's just some notes that he wrote, basically. So that's why it's not necessarily all too clear what he meant. But the idea of self-motion is a Hegelian concept, and you know, when I was in that back and forth with the Trotskyists who didn't like dialectics, I think they had this joke on their site which was like, how many dialecticians does it take to turn a light bulb, or like a switch a light bulb, um, and it said none, because the light bulb switches itself or replaces itself, and that's a, you know, okay, it's kind of clever, but it's also really stupid. Now, what does that joke mean? It means that if matter is in self-motion, you know, everything just does things by itself. You don't need anything else. Now, there's really two aspects of that. The main idea is that in dialectics, the reason for change and for development are contradictions in the thing itself, inside the thing in itself. So it's not caused by external forces mainly, it's mainly caused by the thing's internal contradictions. Now, we got into this debate about whether or not external contradictions are or external forces are a factor, because I said that, well, obviously external forces are still a factor, but they said that no, this idea of external forces is like a Stalinist invention that was invented to fix the otherwise ridiculous theory, and I was like, okay, whatever. But if you just read the Dialectics of Nature by Engels, it talks about how like a seed of grain can grow into a plant, you know, crops, if it is in the proper conditions. If there's like light and moisture and heat, then it can grow. So obviously he's talking about external contradictions, but the primary reason why the thing grows is the internal contradictions of it. I believe it was Mao who said that the best way to understand this is that if you take an egg and you apply heat, then it hatches into a chicken. But if you take a stone, or an egg-shaped stone, and you apply heat, then it doesn't. It never hatches into a chicken. All that happens is it might break or melt or something, because the nature of the thing in itself is different. So the real reason for its changes are the thing's internal nature, internal makeup, and those limit what it can actually do. And that also applies to when we're talking about what is an opposite of what. Because there's all these difficulties that arise from language when you think about it. Like, the opposite of man is alien, so therefore men become aliens or space aliens or something. No. Um, the way you actually know what the actual opposite is, and not just what, you know, your cultural background might make you think is considered the opposite of something, it depends on the actual nature of the thing. Because dialectics is not magic. I mean, it would be magic if if people just turned into animals or into space aliens or something. The thing's own nature and own internal factors determine what it actually becomes. But getting back to the idea of self-motion, I think to say that self-motion means that a light bulb can replace itself, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the concept, because it assumes that the light bulb exists in a vacuum. Because the biggest thing about dialectics is that everything is interconnected. Everything affects everything, not in any kind of weird new age magic kind of way, but just because of various forces, like gravity, for example. Things have gravity that impacts other things around them. Things, you do something to somebody else, they react to that, you react to how they react to that, and it's basically just trying to push this idea that things don't necessarily exist in a linear cause and effect line of interaction. It's not that there's cause and then there's the effect. No, in according to dialectics, it's more like the two things both have effects on each other and cause changes in each other, and then those changes cause different kinds of changes and different kinds of causes in a way. So it's just trying to go against this idea, this very simplistic idea that, okay, there's one cause, then there's an effect, and then there's another cause, another effect. No, it's more like a dialectical relation between two objects. But what exactly is self-motion? Well, self-motion is a Hegelian concept, and I really should get back to reading more Hegel, trying to understand it a little bit better. And it's difficult because of the language, but it's also difficult just because the concepts themselves are difficult, and because it's idealism. To me, idealism is a lot more difficult to understand than materialism, because it's so abstract and it's so, it's not concrete at all. It's so theoretical. But basically, to me, to say that self-motion means that things that exist in a vacuum change themselves, that's totally wrong, because with Hegel, the whole idea was that Hegel's idea, or Geist, which he basically thought was God. It was his God, and his view on God was that God is like infinite, that it includes everything, because he kind of thought that if God is not infinite, if everything is not included in him, then is he really God? If he, it just can't be just some big dude on a cloud. It has to be this thing that encompasses everything. So basically, the self-motion of the idea means that, because to him, the idea is the thing that exists first, because he's an idealist. So it's the self-motion of the idea. But if we think about it in terms of materialism, like the self-motion of matter, then I think the best way to understand what Hegel really meant is that if you, he was an idealist, but if you took it to materialism, just look at the world. The world is entirely matter. Like, if somebody was to say that there's just self-motion of matter and energy, and in a way energy is also matter, so, in a different state, but okay, so it's basically, there's only matter. It's just self-motion of matter. How is that incorrect? It's not. It's correct. It's absolutely correct. So the idea of self-motion of matter doesn't mean that, okay, my coffee cup is just going to start moving around on its own. No, it means that matter itself is in constant self-motion without anything else doing anything. Similarly to Hegel's idea, or spirit, however, Geist, it's German. It kind of means like ghost or spirit or idea or mind, however you want to translate it. So that idea is in constant self-motion, and that causes everything. There's no other thing affecting it. It's the only thing that there is. So that's at least how I understand self-motion. But that's still something that I'm trying to learn. Let's see, was there anything else? I guess one last thing, one last correction. It's about the unity of opposites again. People seem to get this wrong quite often, and especially people who are critical of dialectics, they don't seem to understand this part of dialectics. They don't understand that when there's a revolution, they say that the workers become the rulers, but they don't understand that the workers themselves, it's not a change within the worker themselves, it's a change in the society, because the workers and capitalists they're the opposites that exist in a unity of opposites. It's a pair of opposites. And then when those two things create a new synthesis, that is the new society. So, the old society encompasses capitalists and workers. who are the opposites. They're the contradictions within that system. When that contradiction resolves itself, it resolves itself by the system changing into a new system, not that the capitalist himself like changes into a dog or something, or the worker himself changes into a capitalist. No, the system changes, and then that system has new contradictions in it. So the workers become the ruling class, but they don't become the exact same ruling class that existed before in the old system. Similarly, the capitalists become the oppressed class, but they don't become the same oppressed class that existed before. So basically, how do you avoid this mistake? You avoid this mistake by understanding that when there's contradictions in something, then that thing itself changes. But when there's contradictions between some two things, then that doesn't mean that either of those things change. Like if there's contradictions between workers and capitalists, that means that the system they live in will change, because that is basically contradictions in the system. But if there's contradictions within the worker somehow, then that causes the worker himself to change. But the contradiction between workers and capitalists don't cause, that they don't make the worker himself change and the society not change. And the only thing that really happens to the worker is that his position in that society is different, because the society itself is different. I hope that makes sense. So yeah, that's pretty much it.